My name is James Pearce and I'm the Liverpool FC correspondent for The Athletic. I'd worked for the Liverpool Echo for 14 years before that. Since the summer of 2019, I've been following Liverpool around wherever they go all over the world for The Athletic. Usually covering Liverpool press conferences, they tend to be 1:30 on like a Friday before a weekend game, and that tends to be throughout Jurgen Klopp's reign when he's preferred to do them. Usually you go to every press conference kind of armed with a bit of a plan in terms of what you're looking to get out of it. My job now is probably slightly different than when I was at the Echo, because of the sheer amount of space in the paper you had to fill, and in terms of wanting so many stories for online, you kind of had to go to the press conferences armed with lots of questions. And after the main press conference, Jurgen Klopp does a short separate chat for the newspapers. So I used to be part of that. That was kind of when you'd kind of save your questions for. A lot of the time, especially in my role now, a lot of your time is also spent working on longer term pieces. Recently, I've been over to Hungary to spend a day with Dominic Szoboszlai's dad. So you kind of like, there's all kinds of things you're juggling at the same time. Because, I think some people have this perception that you can just ring a club as a journalist and they'll tell you, and that just isn't really reality. So that's where obviously contacts comes into it. And sometimes that might be members of the backroom staff, it could be players, it could be agents. So it's just really like an ongoing dialogue. You try and like not leave it too long in terms of keeping in contact with certain people, just to try and stay on top of stuff. Transfers is obviously a big part of it, especially in the summer months where there's just such a thirst for information about who's going to be next in, and that probably takes up a kind of frustratingly large amount of time, because you find yourself chasing so many kind of rumours. And as we know these days with social media, it's so easy for rumours to gather pace. It tends to be the way that you'll find out off one particular person some information, or you might hear it secondhand off someone. But my next thing is, right, I need to find out if this is true. Not this is true, I'll just write it. I would never write a story unless I've got two different people telling me it's right. So, what we would describe as being double sourced. And that's where, I'm quite lucky at The Athletic that we've got a lot of other well-connected reporters as well. When you think you've got it stood up, then you go to the club and say, just to let you know, I've been told such and such, and give them what we call the writer reply. Now, sometimes a club might say absolutely no comment, got nothing to say. Sometimes they might say, yes, kind of off the record, you're right, which is what you want to hear. Other times they might tell you, no, you're 100% wrong. But obviously sometimes they're telling you that because they just don't want you to write it. So it's always a judgment call in terms of like weighing up how good is this information. Can't really think of any times when like I've wanted to ask him something and not, because sometimes you don't get the chance to. That's the other thing. Like quite often in the press conference, there's a press officer sat at the front who, especially after games, when sometimes a Klopp or any other manager for that matter might have done 6, 7, 8 post-match interviews already, where they have to go all the way along the line doing all the different global rights holders. So the written press one tends to be the last one. Not surprisingly, sometimes he might only take 3, 4 or 5 questions in that section. So sometimes you just don't get the opportunity to ask what you want. Well, I've definitely asked him a few questions that he's taken exception to. It was about a year ago, actually, after Liverpool lost away at Wolves, when, a pretty miserable 3-0 defeat. And they're probably the most awkward press conferences. So after that game, because he talked before the game against Wolves about having a full week to prepare and how that would benefit for Liverpool. So I just kind of said, how alarming is it as a coach when you've had a whole week to prepare and a team looked like they're not prepared for the game? And is that down to them, or do you feel as if there was something wrong with the way you prepared for this game? Yeah, that one didn't go down too well. He refused to answer it, even though it was a bit of a mix-up, because he'd actually taken exception to something he'd read elsewhere in another publication the day before, rather than anything on The Athletic.
It's very difficult to talk to you, but if I'm 100% honest, I would prefer not to do that. You know why? For all the things you wrote, so if somebody else wants to ask that question, then I answer it, and if not, you ask it. And then can you say it again, please?
Even earlier on this season, I had one when everyone knows a bugbear of his is having so many 12:30 Saturday lunchtime kickoffs. So I asked him about that. I think he said to me, wow, is that a real question? is that honestly a real question? And you kind of sat there going, yeah. And he kept saying, are you honestly asking me that? Are you really asking me that? And you're like thinking, and you can sense the whole room's kind of looking at you. But you're like, yeah, I am. The format with Klopp tends to be pretty much unchanged, where Sky Sports will ask the first 2 or 3 questions. Then the Premier League Productions, who do the global Premier League channel, they tend to then ask the next few questions, and then it goes to kind of Radio Merseyside will get a couple of questions, and then any other radios that are there, sometimes maybe Talk Sport, the Press Association, then and then it's kind of like anyone else in that main section, the press conference. That would be then after the Press Association, when I would be able to ask stuff if I wanted to, and then Klopp would then go out the room into a side room to speak to the newspapers for 5 minutes. And sometimes you'd see, what we kind of become known as like the 10:30 p.m. Klopp stuff, which tends to be, it'll come out online at 10:30 p.m. on a Friday night for the Saturday papers. That footage last season would have been on Sky Sports News on a Saturday morning. Now, they decided this season that actually it's better to not have the cameras rolling for that, which I think is definitely better for the newspapers, because I think when the cameras aren't there, of course, you're able to talk to a manager in a way that probably is a bit more laid back, where he knows that he could say something, and then he might say, well, actually, off the record, I'll tell you this or something. Where obviously, when you've got a camera on you, you can't say anything that's off the record. Tend to get to the ground about between like 2 hours and an hour and a half before the game. It varies really. Sometimes I might have like a kind of a TV commitment before the game. The period before the game can also be quite a good networking opportunity. Like in the media room, you can get something to eat, get a drink, and quite often you find like lots of ex-Liverpool players working in the media will be in that media room before the game, so you can catch up with people, find out, they may be bits of gossip that they've heard, whether it's about transfers or goings on at the club or anything like that. Now, you kind of hope to have a bit of a plan in terms of what your written piece is going to be about before the game. It's always good to go into a game with kind of like, well, Liverpool have had twice as many goals from midfield as last season. Watch the midfield today, or I spent one game, I think a couple of seasons ago, just watching Virgil van Dijk for 90 minutes. Just don't take your eyes off him, just write about him. It's tricky really, because I always thought it would be when Liverpool won the league, because I was one of the lucky ones who was actually inside Anfield when Jordan Henderson lifted the Premier League trophy, because of course it was behind closed doors during the pandemic, and I don't know, there could have only been maybe 300 people inside the ground that night. As incredible as it was to be able to say I was there, it was like you couldn't help but feel it was like quite sad in a way that after so long, that Liverpool weren't able to celebrate it in such a momentous achievement with their supporters. So I think for that reason, I'd have to go for winning the Champions League final in 2019, because also that was my last game covering Liverpool for the Echo, and I'd been the main Liverpool correspondent there for about 8.5 years, and there'd been some pretty dismal times during that period, and times when Liverpool weren't even anywhere near the Champions League, let alone serious contenders to win it. And I kind of knew, I hadn't handed in my notice at the Echo at that point, but I knew I'd be leaving to join the Athletic, and it was like, this would be the most special way to kind of sign off after 15 years at the Echo, if my last match for the Echo was writing about Liverpool winning the Champions League for the 6th time. That would have to be my pick in terms of moments in my career so far.